Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another recap. This time it's round two of Ottawa Winter Open. I managed to win round one pretty comfortably with the white pieces. And now in round two, I was facing a talented Chinese player, Leon Zhu. His rating was around like 1967, and his CFC rating was, I think, around 2160. And this is generally a type of game that I sometimes struggle with when I play tournaments. Like usually round one against people around like 1900 CFC or like 2000 CFC, it's more doable even if I have black. But especially in round two when I face someone in high 2100 CFC or 2200 CFC and I have the black pieces, these are the sorts of games that I sometimes historically struggled with in my tournaments. So I went to this game having a quick look at my opponent's games, and the problem was he didn't have that many games in the database, so I wasn't 100% sure what he's going to do. Like, the games he had against Karo Khan were pretty old, and I was looking at other options against e4 as well, maybe some e5 or c5, but since I didn't know exactly what he's going to do, I decided to stick with what I know the best. And I started with c6, the Karo-Khan defense, and indeed he went with the exchange variation. So he took on d5, played bishop to d3, and after knight c6, he played c3s. So here, there are two different moves that I usually play. Like sometimes I play knight f6, just continuing the development and also preparing bishop to g4. And also I play this other move pretty frequently, which is queen to c7. And the idea is to stop the bishop from getting to f4. Now I remember before the game, for some reason, I was kind of predicting that he's going to go with the knight e2 castles queen e1 line. So this is the line I looked at a little bit more before the game. But he kind of surprised me with the move h3. And this move is actually pretty annoying to face. And the reason it's pretty annoying is that usually knight f3 and knight e2 are both met with bishop g4. But after h3, my bishop is kind of struggling to get out. So one idea that I usually go for is to play g6 and bishop f5 to try and develop this bishop. And that's what I played during the game. But there's another idea that I was checking and it looked pretty interesting. And the idea is to go e6. So it looks like a pretty bad move, just locking the bishop in. But the thing is, when I play e6 like this h3 move is not useful anymore. It's kind of a waste of tempo. And the setup I'm going to go for is that after knight f3, I'm just going to develop my bishop. And I'm going to put my knight on e7. So even though my bishop is a little bit bad on c8, in general, I will castle next. I will play bishop d7, knight g6, f6. And white is still slightly better, but black's idea is usually to go with the majority attack in the center with f6, e5. And I will maybe try to bring this rook as well to support my e5 break. In general, the next moves are probably going to be knight g6, bishop d7, and f6 to just start slowly building up and attacking the center. So another interesting idea to meet this line, which I didn't go for in this game. And I played g6 in this position. So I played g6, intending bishop f5. So in this game, in this position, I had one previous game in 2022. I think it was December 2022 against Grandmaster Jean-Rodrigue Lemieux, who represented Canada on board one of the Olympiad this year. And he hit me with this very interesting move, queen to c2. And the idea of queen c2 is that it stops bishop f5. And now black is actually kind of struggling to really develop this bishop. I remember in that game, I started by developing my pieces normally, but then I was like, what should I do with my bishop? I put it on d7. At some point, I had to go e5, and I got some sort of a shambolic position in the end where under positional pressure, I actually blundered a tactic. Like, I saw something, but then I missed one candidate move at the end of the line, and he converted that game pretty flawlessly. But checking that game after queen c2, I realized that black has this very nice move f6. The idea is just to go e5 and grab the whole center. Of course, white can't just take because the king is pretty safe on d8. And f6 is a tough move to come up with, over the board, but I knew it, and I was hoping that my opponent actually goes queen c2. I was hoping he had prepared from that game, but he didn't. So funnily enough, after that game against Sean, we were analyzing together on his computer, and when he was looking that queen c2 wasn't great after f6, he realized that knight e2 is the top engine choice. And I remember looking on Sean's computer back then, I saw that this is like plus 0.6 and it's a top engine move. And my opponent, Leon, shows up and blitzes knight e2. So here I'm already starting to get a little bit concerned. I was like, okay, this kid clearly knows what he's doing. He already has the whole line prepared. He knows the best engine line. So I need to be really careful about this game. So I played knight f6. He castled. And I played bishop f5. Pretty normal stuff. Developing my bishop and trying to trade off the light squared bishops. He took. I took back. Bishop goes to f4, attacking my queen on c7. I played queen d7, knight d2, and e6. So far, things were pretty normal. We were both kind of playing fast, like not like super blitzing, but relatively fast. I think we both had over 1 hour and 20 minutes here. And here he spent some time and played a very surprising move, which initially I thought it's really bad, but in reality it wasn't. He played b4. So it looks like b4 really weakens the c3 pawn. And if he goes c4 down the line, both d4 and b4 pawns are going to be weak. And in general, I would be happy to play rook c8 and put so much pressure down the c file. So yeah, knight f3 was the move that I was expecting, and it's the most natural move. And the way the line usually goes is that white will play something like knight e5 and then puts the knight on d3, and then we make some trades of the bishops, and he's going to go f3, try to restrict my knight on f6, because e4 square is always pretty powerful. He doesn't want to allow this. And then in the end, white is trying to go like queen c1, queen f4, trade the queens, and then just have a slight pull in the endgame because of a better pawn structure. So this is one way he could have played, but he decided to go b4. So one thing about b4 is that it kind of discourages me from long castling. So in some lines, I'm considering bishop d6, long castle, rook g8, and just trying maybe even double on the g file and try to attack the pawn. But with b4 already on the board, I'm kind of discouraged from long castling, because then queen a4, b5 stuff are going to come. There's also like a4, a5, b5 ideas. So I wasn't really willing to long castle just yet. So I played bishop d6, we traded the bishops, and he played the move a3. The idea is pretty clear. He's protecting the pawn on b4, and he's preparing c4 to break open the center. So now came a very big moment in the game. This is a moment where I really spent a long time trying to find out the best idea. So I was really trying to figure out where to put my king. Of course, short casting has its own problems because the g file is open. And long casting also has its own problems because a pawn storm is coming with some queen a4 ideas. So I wasn't sure about either of them. There's also like knight e7 idea, which is interesting, because then after c4 takes, the d5 square is going to be useful for my knight. So I was considering all these ideas, and in the end I decided to go with knight e4, which was a slight inaccuracy, which I will tell you why. So there are 3 ways to play this position, and all of them are equally good. I could play knight e7, which is one of the options. So if c4, I'm just simply going to take and drop the queen back. And in the game, I was a little worried of this with queen a4 check. And I was like, if knight c6 back, now knight e5. And there's going to be so much pressure on this pinned knight. But I can easily go king f8. And even though it looks a little bit bad, just losing the castling rights and putting the king on f8, with rook g8 and knight d5 coming, my king is actually pretty safe on f8. And my rook on g8 is also pretty powerful on the open file. So this was one way to play. The other way was to short castle, which I also saw. And after c4, again, you drop the queen back. Personally, I was a little worried of him going b5 and then putting this knight on e5. And I was like, I don't have enough pressure on the d4 pawn as well. But I can simply go knight g6 and even slightly better. Maybe in the long term, I can press this d4 pawn. And the last one, which after the analysis I actually liked the most, funnily enough, was to long castle. So again, because of these pawns already here, I was a little bit discouraged to long castle. And I saw that after c4, it's actually not so scary because I can take and play queen d5. And now with the rook on d8, there's so much pressure on the pawn on d4. And after knight e3, I saw that I can go queen e4 and the pressure on the d4 pawn will continue. So yeah, queen a4 was the move that kind of scared me in the game. Like I saw I can go king b8, but after b5 and c4, I was like, there's just too much initiative going on this side of the board. I was worried that in some lines, this knight might land on a5. He's going to bring the rooks and sacrifice something on c6. Like, of course, with correct play, this is never going to happen. Like, indeed, the best way for white is to put the knight on a more active e5 square. And I can threaten mate, and after f3, just simply defend the pawn. And the game will continue. The game is pretty much equal. Just like 0.1 advantage for black. But there's not much to worry about in this position. In the game, I played the move knight e4. So to me, it seemed like a really good move because I was like, with knight e4, if he takes, I'm going to take with the f pawn. And this always felt pretty interesting to me. To get the pawn on e4 and then maybe protect it with f5 and get this nice pawn diamond in the center. And an interesting line that I calculated in the game was the move c4. So initially, I was like, if knight takes d2, if queen takes, I can simply take. But then I saw c5, and I was like, this looks a little bit sketchy now with all these pawns coming on the queen side. But then I realized I have this nice little intermezzo with knight here, rook g8 check, king h1, and then queen e7. And I wasn't honestly sure about the evaluation of this position, but I thought at least with the queen coming to h4 and maybe the rooks getting doubled on the g file, I will get enough counterplay against his king. And he's going to be hesitant to go into this line. I actually spent a long time calculating this c4 line and trying to evaluate, but he kind of blitzed knight takes c4. And here he played rook c1, which is a slight inaccuracy. Like, he could have taken advantage by instantly playing f3. The problem for me is that when I go f5 and these trades happen, after rook c1, now I kind of have to long castle. There's no short casting option anymore, and keeping the king in the middle is also, like, extremely dangerous. So I have to long castle. And then after c4 takes king b8, these double pawns on the e file are actually not so great, and they can be vulnerable in the long run. So I actually need to be a little bit careful in this position. So he didn't play f3. He played rook c1. And again, like, long casting was the best move here in this position. It's kind of similar to the same ideas. Like, I was a little bit scared to go to long castle in this game. But it was actually the best. I played knight e7. Normal move, trying to, like, get this knight to the d5 square. c4, takes. Now I can't long castle anymore, so I had to short castle. And even though the g file is open, I was like, okay, I'm going to go king h8, rook g8, rook g6, or maybe put a knight on g6, and my king is going to be pretty safe. And that is actually true, but white has some resources which we see in the rest of the game. So he played knight g3, which is not the best move. He could have gone queen c1 to prepare queen g5 check, and also at the same time rook to c7. And if king h8, he can again go with this f3 idea to try and open up more files on my king. And all of a sudden, with the rook coming to f3, queen on h6, the knight coming as well, there might be some dangers to my king. So the best I can do is to go f5. He can still go f3, but he also has this idea of queen g5 check and just trying to trade the queens. And the thing is, rook c7 is a major threat now. Like, if you get to this endgame, if I take first, then e6 pawn is weak. If I don't take, if I defend my queen, then rook c7 is going to come. So the endgame is actually going to be a little bit tricky for me to hold. It's still, of course, playable. Like, I have ideas with, like, knight d5 and then lifting the rook to a6. But it would have been tricky for me to play the endgame if he had gone for this. So he played knight g3. And I played f5, pretty normal move, queen to d2. And here again, I made an inaccuracy on how to place the pieces. So initially, I thought my king is pretty open, so I would have liked to put my knight on g6. So the best move in this position, though, is to play knight d5. In the game, it looked like to me that the knight on d5, even though it's the strongest square, it's a little bit far from my king. And with queen h6, knight h5 ideas coming, my king might actually get into some sort of trouble. And indeed, this is actually his best idea. But after rook a d8, there's literally no way to make progress. Like, if he could get a rook on g3, I would have been cooked. But it's actually not easy to get a rook on the third rank. Like, it's going to be taking forever to do that. And meanwhile, I can course, do my own stuff and try to kick the queen away. In fact, after knight f4, which is the best move, trying to trade the strong knight, I can go queen f6, and we're probably going to get an equal rook endgame. So yeah, I played rook a d8. He played queen g5 check, knight to g6, and here's a very key moment in the game. So the best move is to play knight h5, stopping queen f4, and slowly starting to build some attack. But here he made a very interesting move. He played rook fc1. And his idea is to infiltrate on the 7th rank with his rooks. So here, I had a very nice resource that I saw in the game. I literally saw the whole line, but I couldn't evaluate the final position correctly. So the move is queen f4. And I saw that queen f4 basically forces the trade of the queens. So first of all, if he goes queen h5, I can go e3. All of a sudden, he's in some sort of trouble with my attack. And his queen on h5 is actually not that menacing here. So the critical line actually goes queen takes f4, knight takes f4, and I saw rook c7. So if I just go with my rook, he's going to take and double the rooks on the 7th rank, which is not what I want. So the best I have is definitely rook f7. Trades happen, and the other rook comes to c7. I go king f6. He's going to take on b7. I'm going to take on d4. And he's going to take on a7. And I saw this whole position from distance. And my intuition was telling me that I actually do have enough stuff. Like, I saw rook d1 check rook d2, and I was like, yeah, I'm attacking this pawn. My knight and rook are pretty active. And my king is also much more active, but I wasn't sure. Like, in some line, he can take on h7 as well, and he's going to get 2 connected passers on the outside. And it's incredibly difficult for me to evaluate such a position from distance. But in fact, this is actually close to winning for black. Funny thing is that he's going to go king g1 to defend the pawn. I'm going to go knight d3, attacking this pawn on f2. If he pins my knight, I'm going to sidestep with my rook and also stop these passers on the other side. And the pawn f2 is kind of fallen. And if he goes knight h1, which is a passive move, I can start playing f4, e3, and just going with that strong passed e-pawn, which is going to be incredibly difficult to stop. You might think takes, e3, takes, knight g3, but then knight f4, preparing rook g2 and e2, and these pawns are kind of useless. They can't be advanced. If he advances this one drops, and if he advances this one, it drops. So it's actually not easy for him to advance the pawns, while my pawns are actually very strong on the other side of the board. So this one was, I think, the reason I didn't go queen f4 was that it was difficult for me to evaluate the position with 2 connected passers on the outside from distance. So I was like, let's first make a prophylaxis move. Let's play rook to d7, stop rook c7, and then I will think about queen f4 ideas. But he's not going to give me a second chance. He plays knight h5, queen e7, queen h6, and I was like, oh my god, this position is not suddenly looking good. Like, the knight and queen create a lot of threats on g7 and also on f6. Like, for instance, if he plays rook c8 at some point and trades happen and I have to block with a knight, the knight is going to come to f6 and it's going to deliver the killer blow. So here I was starting to get really nervous in the game. I played rook fd8, pretty normal move, putting pressure on d4. And here he started going the wrong direction. Here white is close to winning, actually. Funnily enough, white is close to winning, but the way to play is actually not so easy and intuitive. So he played a very natural move, rook to c8. He's trying to trade a pair of rooks because both of my rooks are guarding the 7th and 8th ranks. So trading one pair actually helps his next rook to actually get into a really good position. The problem with this move is that it's a little bit hasty. What he could have done was to start with a move b5. And the problem that black has here is that all of black's pieces are stuck. I can't really move with this knight. It can't go anywhere good. My queen and rook have to defend the 7th rank. This rook has to defend the 8th rank. And if I go with something like rook takes d4, trying to win a pawn, then he's going to have some sort of tactics with rook e8, knight f6 ideas. My king is just way too open for me to be able to hold this. And this is just dead loss. Like, of course, after b5, I could have just kept waiting. But now I will tell you why playing something slow like b5, a4, a5 first would be better. So he played rook c8. And now I found the best move, queen to f8, forcing the trade of the queens, because now I'm attacking this queen and a rook on c8. Of course, he could also take on d8 with a rook, but then after queen d8, my queen guards the f6 square and also puts pressure on the d4 pawn. And he actually has to come back with a queen to try and consolidate the position. So he decided to take. I took with a king, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and now rook c7. So this is the endgame we got, and I wasn't happy with getting this endgame, honestly, because first of all, there's a lot of perpetual ideas with a rook on the 7th rank and a knight coming to h7. At the same time, I also might be in danger of losing in some lines if he can actually win these queenside pawns and again get these two connected passers on the outside. So here, though, I play this move. Oh my god, sorry about that. I play this move b5, and I cripple these pawns on the queen side. Very important. So now, let's have a quick flashback on why it would have been better if he had pushed these pawns much further. Imagine he could have gotten the same endgame with the same idea with the pawns already on b5 and a4 instead of b4 and a3. Then I would have been in much more trouble in the endgame. But now after b5, all of a sudden, I have some sort of activity. My rook is pretty active. I have ideas like f4, e3 to try and create some sort of play. Like, for instance, if he takes this pawn, like if he becomes a little bit greedy and takes this pawn, I can go rook d1 check, kick this king to h2, and then after f4, with e3 coming, it's actually not so easy to stop this passed e pawn. So correctly so, my opponent decides to activate the king to not let me kick this king to h2. So I played f4, of course, kind of restricting this knight and also getting ready to create a passer. King e2, rook c4, I'm threatening rook c2 check. He goes knight f6, I gave this check, and he played king e1. So the game is pretty much equal here, and I was trying to see which move is actually better. Should I go with f3 or should I go with e3? So initially, my idea was to play e3. And honestly, after analyzing this game, even though the computer says both moves are equal, I personally think e3 would have been more challenging for my opponent to deal with. Because after fe3, fe3, the best move is actually to play the move g3, just saving this pawn on g2. Like a natural move that a human might play is the move knight takes h7 check, and then giving this check and bring the knight back. The problem is that after knight f4, see, they didn't play g3 to restrict my knight. After knight f4 attacking this pawn on g2, he has to capture my pawn. Otherwise, he's in danger of getting mated. And if he takes the pawn e3, I have rook e2 check winning the knight. So black is actually lost in this position. Sorry, white is actually lost in this position. So he should have played g3. And after rook f2, another good thing is that he doesn't have perpetual ideas with the knight. My rook is guarding the f6 square, so he actually has to come back. But of course, again, like here, it's not so easy to create play for black. I might go with some knight e5 ideas at some point. It's a little bit risky, but the top line is actually just some sort of perpetual here again. But I think maybe e3 was the more practical approach if I wanted to win this game. f3 is also like dead equal, like based on the engine. But of course, there's still a lot of play left. And I feel like if he wanted a draw, he could have played this nice move, rook d7. Rook d7 just basically forces a draw right on the spot. And the point is, with a rook on d7, my king has no room to escape from the d file. So whatever I do, let's say I take on g7, he's going to take on h7, and he's going to keep checking me on h7 and f6. And I can't go to h8 because I'm simply going to get mated. So this is a simple draw. But I'm not sure whether my opponent was playing for the win or he just didn't see the idea. Like even here, rook d7 would have been much better. But he took on h7, and that gave me the chance to play king d8. So obviously, if I go king f8, it's going to be a draw. And king d8 actually gives white a slight advantage. But in the game, I was like, as the high-rated player, I should keep the game going, and I should at least try to play for the win. So I played king here, rook d7 check, king c8, and he finds the best move rook d3, attacking my pawn on f3. And here I was starting to get a little bit nervous. I was like, wait, I'm down a pawn, and I don't see enough counterplay. Like, look like with a rook on c2 and a pawn on f3, I can have a lot of stuff. But after knight h4, which I played, I'm simply threatening to play knight g2 check. If king d1, I take the pawn, and if king f1, he's going to get mated. But he can go knight g4. And this is the move that I saw. I played knight h4 anyways, and I saw that he can go knight g4. And I was like, with knight g4 defending this pawn on f2, if I give a check, he can go king d1, and I'm down a pawn. I'm not sure whether it's lost or it's a draw, but it's going to be very difficult for me to play for the win, and if I'm not careful, I might even get pressed in this endgame. Lo and behold, after knight h4, my opponent blitzes knight e4 in 1 second, which really surprised me because simply after rook e2 check, the knight is lost. So I think that was just one moment of rushing too much from my opponent. He actually had some time. He had like 10, 11 minutes, I think. I had like 15 around this point. I don't exactly remember, but yeah, knight e4 was just a huge one-move blunder, which hung the knight on e4. I got really lucky with this one. If he had gone knight g4, my idea was to go king c7, just slowly bring the king into play. And one of White's problems here is that White also doesn't have a good way to make progress. Like, this pawn is blockaded, these pawns are blockaded, this one is blockaded. The knight has to stay here to guard the f2 pawn, and the rook has to keep the pressure on the f3 pawn. And he can't go here because of the fork. So, interestingly enough, the line that he should have found to press for an advantage is to go knight e3, attacking my rook. Looks like after knight g2, I'm doing great, because he can't take and go rook g3 because of rook c1. But then he has king f1, and rook c1 is met by knight d1. So this combo is actually already a little bit difficult to find. Like knight g4, knight e3, knight d1, 3 backward knight moves in a row. It's incredibly difficult. But if he was able to find all of that, after knight f4, he could have traded the rooks, and he could have tried to press me in this knight endgame, which is still holdable because of my activity with the king and the knight. But it's going to be incredibly tricky and difficult for me to try and hold this endgame if he could find all those moves. But instead of spending his time on this move, he actually really blitzed knight e4 in 1 second. And after rook e2 check, the game is gone. Simple as that. He goes king f1, I take the knight. King g1 was played, and here I already knew that I have the game in back, so I took my time. I played rook e5, played rook d4 attacking my knight. Now I played rook g5 check. If he goes king f1, I can trade the rooks with rook d5 because of the mate threats on d1. So he has to go to h1, but now the king is stuck in the corner, and I can create some mating patterns, as we see in the rest of the game. So I rerouted my knight to e5. He started going after this b5 pawn, but it's not going to work. I simply go king d6, rook takes, and now rook g2. So first of all, I make sure that this king is well stuck in the corner. There's no scope of activity left for this king. Now after rook b6 check, I simply drop the king back to c7. And if he takes on e6, I will go knight d3, and the mate is going to be inevitable on f2. So in this position, my opponent resigned the game, and I got a very nice win, very enjoyable win, I have to say. It wasn't the best game for sure. Like, I was under some sort of pressure in some moments of the game. And to be fair, my opponent played a very good game. Like, he had a very good opening preparation. He played the best line, which is h3 and knight e2, and he knew what he was doing until here. And he came up with creative ideas like this b4, a3 idea. I wasn't a big fan, but I thought it's creative. And overall, I think he played a pretty good game. And he just got a little bit unlucky that in one critical moment, he blitzed one move too many by playing knight e4, and after that, the game was gone. So this is another thing that I usually tell all my students. Like, you really need to minimize your blunders, especially in classical games, if you want to be successful. Like, my opponent showed insane opening preparation, amazing understanding and calculation, but just because he blundered in one move, chess is a brutal game. You might play an amazing game throughout. You might have a slightly better position against your high-rated opponent after 3.5 hours of fight. But just one moment, one lapse in concentration with knight e4 is just going to change the whole game, and I will win pretty easily after that. So again, like when you're playing classical chess, I always suggest taking your time, at least like 30 seconds on each move, if the move is not forced, and trying to see like your opponent's checks, captures, and threats in response to that move. Like just quickly look at all the possible checks, captures, and threats, and make sure that they're not something obvious that make you lose the game. Anyways, my opponent blundered, and I got lucky this game. But it was a very sweet win because I was in trouble. I won my game with the black pieces, and it's always enjoyable when you win your second round. You get 2 out of 2 with the black pieces, and you will have the white pieces in round 3. So I hope you enjoyed this recap. Make sure to let me know your opinion and comments about this game in the comment section down below. And stay tuned for round 3. And I'm not going to spoil anything about round 3, but what I can tell you about the round 3 game is that it's my longest game in recent memory. It's literally the longest game that I've ever played in my recent memory. So stay tuned for that game. It's a tough fight, and you're going to enjoy that one as well. Have a great one, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon. Goodbye.